Hi everyone, my name is Bianca Gutierrez and today I'll be presenting my ethical decision-making analysis based on Dilemma 27, also known as to skate or not to skate. In this presentation, I'll be discussing the dilemma, ethical violations, legal considerations, the decision-making model I used, my personal values, and possible outcomes. This case might seem simple at first, but it actually involves multiple layers of ethical responsibility, especially when it comes to confidentiality and professional boundaries. The dilemma. In this scenario, Dr. Earthsky unexpectedly encounters Tony, who is a current client, in a public setting along with his parents, the Hawk family. The dilemma is whether the therapist should acknowledge Tony or not. On one hand, greeting someone is considered polite in everyday life. On the other hand, in a professional setting, even something as small as saying hello can reveal that Tony is receiving therapy. For example, if Dr. Earthsky greets Tony in front of his parents, they might start questioning how they know each other, which could unintentionally expose confidential information. At the same time, if Dr. Earthsky ignores Tony, Tony may feel rejected or confused, especially if he recognizes the therapist and expects a response. So this can create a conflict between being socially appropriate and maintaining professional ethics, and can impact the confidentiality and emotions. So why this is an ethical issue? This situation becomes more complex because it takes place in a public setting where confidentiality cannot be fully controlled. The presence of Tony's parents increases the risk of exposure because they may not be aware that Tony is receiving therapy. Another important factor is that there were already boundary concerns earlier in the relationship, such as the therapist's self-disclosure relating to skateboarding. This is important because it may have already blurred the lines between a professional and personal relationship. Because of this, the therapist's actions can now carry even more weight. This situation is not just about one decision, it's about maintaining consistency, professionalism, and trust over time. And as you can see, my bullet points also explain why this can be an ethical issue. From what I explained: public setting risk, confidentiality, family increases exposure, prior boundary issues complicate, balance ethics versus social norms. Ethical violations. There are confidentiality risks, multiple relationships, boundary confusion, and impact on trust. So there are several ethical concerns in this situation. First is confidentiality. A therapist is responsible for protecting any client information, including the fact that someone is receiving therapy. Second, is the risk of multiple relationships or boundary confusion. If the therapist interacts casually with the client in public, it may make the relationship feel less professional. Third is the impact on trust. If Tony feels ignored, he may feel hurt or confused even. But if his privacy is violated, that could damage trust even more. And this shows how ethical issues are not always straightforward. Even small actions can have significant consequences for the therapeutic relationship. Legal issues. So I have down on my bullet points is confidentiality laws apply, risk of board complaints, legal consequences possible, and higher risk with vulnerable clients. From a legal perspective, confidentiality is extremely important. In California, therapists are required to protect client information at all times. Even something as simple as acknowledging a client in public could be considered a breach if it reveals their identity as a client. For example, if Tony or his family felt that his privacy was violated, they could file a complaint with the licensing board. This is especially important when working with vulnerable populations, because they may be more sensitive to boundary confusion and may not fully understand the situation. And this shows how ethical and legal responsibilities often overlap in professional practice. So, moving on to the decision-making model. So I have down here the Forrester, Miller, and Davis model. We'll be talking about identify dilemma, applying the APA code, evaluate actions, and choosing the best option. And to analyze the situation, I used the Forrester, Miller, and Davis ethical decision-making model. I chose this model because it provides a structured way to think through ethical dilemmas instead of making a quick emotional decision. The steps include identifying the problem, applying ethical codes, evaluating possible options, and considering the consequences before making a decision. This model is helpful because it forces professionals to slow down and think carefully about their actions. Applying the model. So the conflict is the confidentiality versus emotion. Applying the APA standards. Evaluated outcomes. And choosing the least harmful option. When applying this model, the first step was identifying the main conflict, which is confidentiality versus emotional responsiveness. Next, I applied the APA ethic codes, focusing on confidentiality, avoiding harm, and maintaining boundaries. Then, I considered all possible actions, such as greeting the client, ignoring the client, or waiting for the client to initiate contact. I finally I evaluated the consequences of each option, and this did help me to determine which action would best protect the client while minimizing harm. So, personal values. 3 of my personal values would be responsibility, privacy, and independence. My personal values also played a role in this situation. And again, the 3 most important values for me were, again, responsibility, privacy, and independence. Responsibility means doing what is ethically right, even when it feels uncomfortable. Privacy is important because it aligns with confidentiality and protecting personal information. Independence relates to respecting the client's ability to make their own choices. I feel that these values helped guide my thinking throughout this dilemma. Values impact. So I have down supports confidentiality, conflict with social expectations, client controls disclosure, values guide reasoning. My values supported protecting confidentiality, but they also created some internal conflict. For example, socially, it might feel natural or polite to greet someone you recognize, but ethically, protecting confidentiality is more important. And this shows how values and emotions can sometimes conflict with professional responsibilities. In this case, my values ultimately supported allowing the client to decide whether to engage, which respects their autonomy and protects their privacy. Principles and standards. So the APA ethical principles and standards provide clear guidance in this situation. Principle A focuses on avoiding harm, and Principle B focuses on trust and responsibility. Standard 4.01 emphasizes maintaining confidentiality. Standard 3.04 focuses on avoiding harm. And Standard 3.05 addresses multiple relationships and boundary issues. Together, these standards reinforce the importance of protecting the client's privacy and maintaining professional boundaries at all times. So, possible outcomes. There are several possible outcomes in this situation, and each one has different risks. Ignoring the client protects confidentiality, but it may cause emotional harm if the client feels rejected. Greeting the client may feel polite, but it risks revealing confidential information. Waiting for the client to initiate contact allows the client to control the situation. A neutral acknowledgement may reduce awkwardness, but still carries some risk. So this shows that ethical decisions are not always simple or clear-cut. So for the final decision, the most ethical decision in this case is for the therapist to not initiate contact and instead allow the client to decide whether to engage. This approach protects confidentiality, respects the client's independence, and reduces the risk of harm. If the situation creates confusion or emotional impact, it can be discussed later in therapy, which helps maintain trust and clarity in the relationship. And here we are at the last slide with my references. These sources helped guide me in my understanding of ethical decision making, professional boundaries, and confidentiality in this scenario. Thank you.